And look, thank you all for appearing before the committee today. And I know it's the second time that many of you have appeared as witnesses before this inquiry. I'm very conscious of the fact there's a fair few questions from different senators, but before we get to that, and conscious of the fact that we are quite short for time because it is a Senate sitting day, wondering if you'd like to begin by making any kind of opening remarks or an opening statement.
Is it my turn to go? I'm Glenda Stevens, Chief Executive Officer of Homelessness Australia. My organisation consists of 3 founding member groups: the Council for Homeless Persons Australia, National Youth Coalition for Housing, Women's Services Network. Homelessness Australia was started by the Howard government to be a single, clear voice in the homelessness sector at a national level. This morning I'm going to speak about the importance of peak bodies and specifically about Homelessness Australia. Homelessness Australia performs 6 key roles. We provide informed policy advice to government, sector development, community awareness and education. We act as a two-way conduit for information between the homelessness sector and government. We develop key resources for use by the sector and provide strategic input into committees and other organisations. A peak body is a non-government organisation with membership of entities with allied interests, and it offers a sturdy voice for those entities. They provide a one-stop shop for government and the sector to share information, and they conduct cost-effective research and development. HA is a peak body with a broad membership base that includes large national multi-focus providers, as well as small local services like Doris, which is a women's refuge here in Canberra. This diversity of members enables HA to identify trends and challenges faced by the sector from small through to large organisations. Importantly, given that HA is not a sector provider and that our membership is broad and diverse, the advice and information we provide to government and others is without bias. Peak bodies are a value for money method for the government to reach the sector and to hear back about how programs and initiatives are working in practice. Homelessness Australia represents most of the 1,300 different organisations and is regularly in contact with them through written and oral communications. It would be impractical for government agencies to interact individually with these organisations. HA facilitates the two-way flow of information. As well as DSS information, HA has disseminated details for the Royal Commission into Institutional Child Abuse and the current review of Federation. The December announcement to return housing and homelessness, service improvement and sector support funding to government surplus is causing significant turmoil and uncertainty in the sector. This decision has been made prior to the Federation White Paper process, which is purposefully looking at housing and homelessness, and the decision may very well undermine that strategic approach of the Federation process. Decisions in the homelessness sector need to be made through a whole-of-government lens, rather than through seeking short-term, small financial savings for budget. The removal of Homelessness Australia, CHIFA and National Shelter will create an unfillable vacuum. Given the nature of the tender process, we are unable to ascertain the full extent of other valuable sector improvements that have been foregone. Those that we know of are a significant loss. We provide a broad view of the state of the sector, a synthesised version of our members' diverse perspectives and interests. We provide aggregated information so that the government can get a clear picture of the sector as a whole. Through policy development and advocacy, we provide systemic analysis, wide community engagement. We contribute to positive public outcomes and build the capacity of the sector and its workforce to provide best practice frontline services. Without Homelessness Australia, the department and the sector would lose the long-term strategic relationships that we have built up since our creation in 1998. HA conducts numerous media interviews on homelessness and contributes to a diverse range of publications. Our Homeless Persons Week raises community awareness and understanding and increases community connections for services. Our 16 days of advocacy highlighted the interdependence between domestic violence and homelessness. Our sector development work has included hosting Australia's only homelessness-focused not-for-profit conference. With Beyond Blue, we have developed a toolkit for use by workers to identify depression and anxiety. We collaborated with NISA and developed materials to support better interactions between employment and homelessness services. Last year, HA provided a homelessness voice to public submissions to government inquiries, such as the McClure Welfare Review. We represented the sector into 15 strategically selected reference groups. We met with 8 federal ministers and 21 federal politicians. HA also supports the sector through analysis and briefings on research and government policy. More than 20 such reports were produced last year. For a minimal cost, HA effectively and efficiently works towards preventing and ending homelessness. We support the organisations and people who are supporting their clients as they rebuild their lives and re-engage with the wider community. I now turn to another important homelessness funding issue, the National Partnership Agreement on Homelessness. Initially a 4-year agreement, the NPAH has now been extended annually, twice, and it is due to expire in June this year. This agreement needs to be extended with guaranteed funding until after the Federation White Paper process has been completed. The funding from this agreement allows vital frontline services to be provided at a relatively low cost to the government to those with extreme needs. The Street to Home program is an example of the important frontline work that is funded through the NPAH. Street to Home is a national program and is delivered by the St Vincent de Paul here in the ACT. I have here with me today Nathan. He's gone from sleeping rough through transitional housing and recently has been more permanently accommodated in affordable public housing. Now Nathan has used the Street to Home program. He's going to tell the committee some of his story. It will provide you with a taste of the life-changing work that programs such as Street to Home provide to people across Australia. Nathan.
There you go. I was homeless for 8 years nearly before I found out about Street to Home. I was sleeping in a tent out in the bush for a few years, and if I didn't meet up with Street to Home, I'd probably be still there. And yeah, well, I don't really know what else I could say about it.
Can I ask you a question, Mr. Quinnell?
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
How did you find out about Street to Home?
Through another person that was actually homeless.
Right.
He gave me a phone number to ring, and
And were you connected with Centrelink during that time you were living in the tent?
yes.
Yep. And did they talk to you about?
No, I didn't really tell too many people about it
Okay, yeah.
because I was a bit embarrassed at the times.
Understand. And in terms of the work that Street to Home did with you, do you want to tell us the sort of like the pathway that you went from being really very homeless to now housed?
Well, they set me up in a transitional home for a while just to make sure that I can sustain myself, and they just helped me get into public housing.
Right.
Over what period of time was that, Mr.
It's been 12 months now that they've working with me, and they've done such great.
So from the time that you picked up the phone to the time that you were to the time that you were in housing, how long?
12 months, sir.
Yeah, right. Okay, so you were a transition period, and how long ago was that?
Well, I still work with Street to Home today, and it's been like, it was 12 months.
Yeah, and you've been in public housing for about 6 weeks now.
Yeah, I've been in public housing now for 6 weeks.
Congratulations. Well done.
Thank you. Well, without programs like Street to Home, people like, who want to change their lives from what they were.
Many like you?
Yes, I've actually met a few around my age group that are homeless, and it's a more common thing nowadays.
That's good. Sorry, Jan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Quinnell. We may come back to you with
you're
other
right,
questions
thank you.
later.
Did you want to, on behalf of National Shelter, make an opening statement as well? Do you want to? Yep.
I would like to make a brief opening statement. Thanks, Senator. Adrian Pasarski, the Executive Officer of National Shelter. Just briefly about National Shelter itself, we are partly a federated body of state organisations and partly made up of national members, two of which are Homelessness Australia and CHUFA. We represent in the broad many thousands of organisations nationwide and individuals. Our membership tends to be either services that work with tenants or housing organisations, but also extends into the mental health, drug and alcohol planners, architects. We have quite a diverse membership base through the shelter network. But what we seek to do is represent the concerns of consumers within the housing system, and particularly to focus on the shortage of affordable housing in Australia and how at a policy and program level that can be improved and addressed. So we get very modest funding from government through to June 30, and I think the level of it is insignificant in terms of budget repair measures. And I think if the government is very serious about its new consultative attitude, it needs to go beyond just consulting with backbenchers, even though they are very important, and I would recognise that. But it also needs to show that it has a connection with the community. And peak bodies like ours, who have very little recourse to private sources of finance from our membership base, many of whom have funding from government themselves, which is restricted in what they can spend it on, and do not have spare resources, dedicate their resources to direct service delivery, rely on government, therefore, to support peak bodies so that they have forums through which they can express their views and the views of the consumers of all of those services. We've been around for about 40 years, and I think National Shelter is one of those organisations, along with my colleagues on either side of me, that represent civil society at its best in Australia. Without government support for civil society organisations, the country will be poorer, our policy discussions and program discussions will be poorer, and governments will not get the best advice they can from the broad cross-section of community, and won't have the conduit into the sector as a two-way process from our sector to government and from government to our sector about new directions. I just want to make a couple of other points, and the first one relates to the reform of the federation process. It seems to me that these decisions to axe not just our peaks but the whole housing and homelessness program out of the DSS funding preempts decisions that could emerge from the reform of the federation process. Since this government has come to power, they have ended the Housing Ministers' Council, dismantled the Housing Ministers' Advisory Conference, have ended the National Housing Supply Council, have slashed the National Rental Affordability Scheme, and now have removed all housing and homelessness funding from the Department of Social Services. It seems to me that that is a pattern which signals the government's intention to completely withdraw from housing and homelessness funding, which will leave the whole country a lot worse off and represent essentially a massive cost shift to the states and to local government and to the community sector, who end up through their charitable work picking up the pieces of failed government and market policies. Affordable housing in Australia is a market failure, and it's something that the national government has recognised it has a responsibility to intervene in over the last 70 years. That's most of the federation process. It seems to me that we are signalling an intent to get out of that area of policy, and that would be a tragedy. And I would encourage this committee to make that point well known to government, and I'll leave my opening remarks there. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Mrs. Crochet, did you want to make an opening statement as well?
Yep. Again, my name is Carol Crochet. I'm the Executive Director for the Community Housing Federation of Australia. Usually when you're the third person on the panel, you get to just say what they said. But I wanted to add a couple things. First of all, my organization represents community housing providers, and we are the ones who are at the forefront of delivering more affordable housing. We're also involved in the renewal of existing social housing and also meeting some of the new demands that are coming out in terms of people who are coming through the NDIS program and trying to provide housing. What CHUFA does, as most peak bodies, we support the growth and the capacity building of the sector to meet those demands, and the defunding of our organization really undercuts our ability to do that. I just wanted to briefly talk about what I think is lost when you terminate funding for a peak body, and give you some specific examples. Oftentimes, I think when people talk about peak bodies, they think of us as what we bring to the public debate from our sector, which we do. But I think people forget that we're also a conduit for the government to promote their agenda as much as it is to hear voices from the sector. For example, under stakeholder engagement, the reason why stakeholder engagement works so well when it's peak bodies, and particularly with our organization, is because the sector trusts us. They know that the information that we're going to provide is going to reflect their views. And by the same token, the government is also confident that the kinds of information we're going to be providing about their policies is also accurate, so that you get a really good fit. Two quick examples. We did consultations with NRAS providers several years ago, 150 of them in fact, and from that got recommendations on where they saw problems with the programs, where they thought changes could be made, and what their goals and challenges were. And that information was passed on, and we saw changes made. We also recently have done a paper, and I've got a pack that I'd like to present to the committee, about looking at housing for people with disabilities. With the beginning of the national, with the NDIS, we know that we need to provide housing, and what that report did was provide a blueprint for what government needs to do to be able to build the capacity so that there is housing for people with disabilities who are coming into the program. I dare say that that's not the kind of engagement you would get from a group like KPMG. Research function is another one that all of our organizations provide, and by the defunding really decimates this essential level of expertise that our organizations provide to all governments, and they use that information in order to form policy. For example, some of the research we've recently done is looking at what's the impact or the importance of Commonwealth rent assistance to the community housing sector, why it's a vital subsidy, and what are the things that will be lost if that's removed. We also did another one on allocations and rent setting. And in light of the housing, the stock transfers that are going on, it's really important to make sure that we avoid some of the mistakes that have happened in terms of rent setting for in the public housing system. Again, you need that information if you're going to be making policy. And again, not to invoke KPMG, but I don't think you get it at the same price as you get for funding a peak organization. As Adrian said, it's really quite a modest amount of information. A modest amount of money. Sorry, information. Massive amount of information, modest amount of money. And the last, I guess, is about government consultation. What you also get is you get a national perspective, and you're able then to articulate the differences within different providers in different jurisdictions. And you get that if you've got a broad framework to work from. And it's also a way to be able to give ideas for setting policy. I'm going to really tout ourselves on this one. When we were looking at the national regulatory system, there was a set of different options. This is for the community housing sector, on a number of different options on how we might progress that. We talked to the sector who said none of those options really work for us. So our organization put forward a different option, and that's actually the option that was used, and that has been the groundwork, and that's been the framework for the national regulatory system. I guess what I'm trying to say is you really do get value for money, and that it seems that the defunding is really quite a short-sighted activity that works against a more longer-term, productive, cooperative relationship between government and the peaks.
Okay, thank you. Well, look, I know there's a fair few questions from senators. I only had one question myself, and I know there's going to be a fair few questions about the funding and the defunding of these organisations. So I was going to ask something slightly separate. I think it's, and Nathan, thank you so much for coming, and thank you for participating in our inquiry. Thank you for coming in